Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a decade that smelled like cigarette smoke, lawn chemicals, and something faintly metallic that nobody thought to question. We're talking about the 1970s, and before we go any further, I just want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, you sent in the idea, and honestly, it is exactly the kind of topic this channel was made for. Your suggestions shape everything here, and I mean that sincerely. If you are new, please subscribe, and if you have been here for a while, a like goes such a long way. Oh, and the channel is now on Spotify too, so if you like falling asleep to these videos, you can find the link in the description and let it play through the night. Now dim the lights, put on a fan if you have one, settle in somewhere comfortable, because we are about to spend some time in a world that felt completely ordinary to the people living in it. Have you ever wondered what a regular Tuesday afternoon looked like in 1973? What did the hardware store smell like when you walked through the door? What did children actually do after school, with no one watching, no screens in their pockets, no one tracking their location? What did a family road trip feel like before anyone thought to ask whether the back seat was safe? What did a backyard barbecue sound like when the neighbour kids were playing a game that would be banned within the decade? There is something strange and quietly fascinating about the 1970s. It was a decade that believed in freedom, perhaps a little too firmly. A decade that trusted products, habits and customs that science had not yet caught up with. People were not reckless. They were simply living in the moment they had been given, the same way we live in ours. And just like that, it is 1972. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower is running. Kids are outside doing something their parents have not thought too carefully about. The television is on in the next room, and a cigarette ad just played between the cartoons. The day is wide open, and nothing about it feels dangerous at all. There is a particular kind of gravity that railroad tracks have on a child, something low and thrilling and ancient, the way the steel rails stretch away in both directions towards somewhere you cannot quite see. In the 1970s, those tracks were not a place to stay away from. They were a destination. You and your friends would walk the rails after school on a Tuesday, balancing with your arms out, daring each other to stay on longer, and the whole thing felt as natural as riding your bike to the corner store. The tracks ran behind a lot of neighbourhoods back then. They cut through the edges of towns, past the backs of warehouses and the far ends of fields, and they connected places in a way that felt almost mythological to a child standing at one end of them. You did not need a reason to go there. The tracks themselves were the reason. The steel was warm in summer, heated all day by a sun that did not ask permission, and when you pressed your sneaker against the rail and balanced, the whole world narrowed down to that one thin line beneath your foot, and how long you could hold it. You placed pennies on the rails. This was a ritual as serious and deliberate as anything you did in those years. You chose the penny carefully, set it flat against the steel, and then you waited. Sometimes you waited a long time. You sat in the gravel beside the tracks and talked about nothing in particular, the way children do when they have hours and nowhere urgent to be, and eventually the ground would begin to tremble in a way you felt in your chest before you heard anything with your ears. Then the sound would come, low and building, and you would scramble back and watch the train pass with the kind of full-body attention that nothing else in your week demanded. And when it was gone, the air still shaking faintly around you, you would walk back to the rail and find your penny, flattened and warm and slightly oval, and you would hold it in your palm like something you had made yourself. Nobody came to tell you to leave. There were no signs that meant anything to you, no fences that could not be stepped around, no adults stationed at the edge of the gravel to explain the physics of what a train weighs or how long it takes one to stop. The railroad companies had rules, but those rules existed in a world of paperwork and adult concerns that had nothing to do with a Tuesday afternoon in the 1970s. You were a child. The tracks were there, and the distance between those two facts was all the permission you needed. There were older kids who knew more elaborate versions of the game. Some of them put their ears to the rail to feel the vibration of a train that had not yet appeared around the bend. Some of them walked the trestle bridge at the edge of town, stepping from tie to tie over the water below, and came back to tell the story with a particular kind of quiet pride. You listened to those stories the way you listened to everything in those years, with the part of your mind that was already calculating whether you were brave enough to do the same thing, and when. The tracks were also simply a good place to think. On an afternoon when the house felt small or the summer felt long, you could walk out to the rails and follow them for a while, the gravel crunching under your shoes, the wooden ties spaced at a rhythm your legs eventually learned to match. The smell of the creosote soaking the ties rose up in the heat, dark and medicinal, and the grass along the edges grew tall and undisturbed. It was a corridor that belonged to no one and therefore to everyone, and a child who needed a little space could find it there. Looking back now, the danger is obvious. Modern trains move faster and arrive more quietly than the ones you grew up hearing from a mile away. The stopping distances are longer. The consequences of a misjudgment are the same as they always were. Organisations now spend considerable effort teaching children and adults alike to treat railroad property as what it legally and physically is, somewhere you do not belong without authorisation. The fines are real, the risks are documented, and the gap between the world that allowed this and the world that forbids it is exactly the gap that a generation of children walked across without knowing they were on a crossing at all. But on a Tuesday afternoon in the 1970s, none of that had arrived yet. The tracks were just there, warm and silver in the late sun, stretching out towards somewhere you had never been. Your friends were beside you. Your penny was in your pocket. And the only thing you were thinking about was whether you could make it all the way to the trestle and back before supper, and what you would say when you got home about where you had been. You would probably say nowhere, just outside, and that would be the truth more or less. In 1976 you reached into a bag of M&Ms and something was wrong. The red ones were gone. Not missing exactly, just gone, as if the candy company had decided red was no longer a colour worth having. The reason, when you heard it, involved something called red dye number 2, a food colouring linked to health concerns, and a wave of public worry that swept through the country and changed the contents of candy bags without anyone fully agreeing on whether it needed to happen at all. The thing about red dye number 2 is that it had been in use for decades. It coloured the maraschino cherries on top of sundaes, the frosting on birthday cakes, the inside of gelatin moulds that appeared at church potlucks and family picnics across the country. It was in beverages and lipstick and medicines shaped like little fruit flavours that children chewed without complaint. It was so ordinary, so embedded in the texture of American food, that removing it required not just a regulatory decision, but a kind of collective renegotiation with what everyday things were made of. The studies that raised the alarm were conducted on rats, and the doses involved were enormous, far beyond what any person would consume in a lifetime of normal eating. But the headlines did not linger on the dosage details. They said cancer, and they said die, and they said children, and that was enough. The country was already in a mood to distrust the things it had been given without question. The 1970s were that kind of decade, one that had begun pulling back the curtain on comfortable assumptions, and red dye number 2 became part of a longer story about what had been in the food all along. Mars Incorporated found itself in a strange position. The company had never used red dye number 2 in its M&Ms at all. The red candies were coloured with red number 40, a different compound entirely, one that was not under scrutiny and had not been flagged by any study. By any rational accounting, there was no reason to remove the red M&Ms from production. But public perception does not always follow rational accounting, and in 1976 red food colouring of any kind had become something people looked at sideways. Mars made the decision quietly and without much fanfare. The red ones would go, and the remaining colours would fill the bags instead. For 11 years the red M&Ms were absent. Children who grew up during that stretch didn't miss what they had never known, but older candy buyers noticed the gap. There was something slightly wrong about a bag without red, like a crayon box with a colour removed. The other colours were fine. The candy itself was unchanged. But the absence created a small, persistent question that nobody could quite answer to their satisfaction. The red M&Ms returned in 1987, reintroduced with something approaching fanfare, coloured once again with red number 40, which had been re-examined and cleared. The whole episode had lasted over a decade and involved no actual danger to the person eating the candy, only the appearance of danger, which turned out to be sufficient to reshape a product that millions of people ate without thinking every single week. There is something worth sitting within that. The 1970s were full of moments like this one, moments when the gap between actual risk and perceived risk turned out to matter less than the fear itself. People were beginning to read labels, beginning to ask what exactly was in the things they consumed without a second thought. Sometimes the answer was alarming, and sometimes it was simply that a candy company had made a cautious decision to remove a colour nobody actually needed. And the bags went on, and children went on eating them, and the red ones waited in a kind of chemical limbo until the climate shifted, and they were allowed to come back. You probably did not think about any of this at the time. You reached into the bag, noticed the colours available, and ate what was there. That is what people do. They eat what is in front of them and trust that someone, somewhere, has thought carefully about what went into it. In the 1970s, that trust was beginning to develop complications. But on most afternoons, the candy was still sweet, the bag still rustled satisfyingly when you reached inside, and whatever was missing was easy enough to forget. Until the next time you went looking for the red one and remembered, again, that it was gone. In much of the country during the early 1970s, turning 18 meant something. You could vote, you could be drafted into a war, and in many states you could walk into a bar and order whatever you liked without a second glance from the bartender. The argument was simple and felt unassailable at the time. If a young man was old enough to carry a rifle in Vietnam, he was old enough to have a drink when he got home. The 26th Amendment had passed in 1971, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, and in the logic of that moment the drinking age followed naturally. The amendment had come partly from the pressure of the war itself, from the hard and reasonable question of why a 19-year-old could be sent overseas and could not cast a ballot. Once that argument had been won, it extended easily into other areas of adult life. If you could vote, the thinking went, you could decide for yourself whether to have a beer on a Friday night. States moved quickly. By the mid-70s, the legal drinking age had been lowered to 18, 19 or 20 in most of the country. Bars adjusted. Grocery stores adjusted. The social landscape around young people and alcohol shifted in a way that felt, to most people living through it, like a simple recognition of something that had always been true. Young adults were adults. Adults could drink. The consequences arrived alongside the freedom. Researchers began tracking what happened on the roads, and what they found was difficult to argue with. Fatal accidents involving young drivers increased. Alcohol was a factor in a significant portion of traffic deaths, and the youngest drivers, those newly legal and newly mobile, appeared in those numbers with a frequency that began to draw serious attention. The freedom that had felt like common sense was producing outcomes that were harder to defend than the principle behind it had been. Mothers Against Drunk Driving formed in 1980, founded by a woman who had lost her daughter to a drunk driver, and who turned her grief into something organised and persistent and eventually impossible to ignore. The campaign that followed was not just about drinking ages, it was about the entire culture surrounding alcohol and driving, the casual acceptance of it, the way a person could leave a party clearly impaired and get behind the wheel and have neighbours who watched it happen and said nothing because that was simply what people did. By 1984, Congress had passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, attaching federal highway funding to the requirement that states raise the drinking age back to 21. The states complied, one by one, and by 1988 the map had changed completely. The brief era of the 18-year-old drinker was over, closed off as quietly as it had opened, and the bartenders adjusted again, and the grocery stores adjusted again, and the country moved on. What remains is the memory of a moment when the rules felt different, when a young person could sit down at a bar on the evening of their 18th birthday and order a round for their friends and have it served without ceremony. Whether that felt like freedom or simply like normalcy depended entirely on when you were born and what you'd been told to expect, and whether the roads you drove home on that night stayed quiet until morning. You pulled your child's pyjamas out of the dryer on a Tuesday night, warm and soft, and you folded them without a second thought. They were treated with flame retardants, as most children's sleepwear was in that era, because keeping kids safe from fire was a priority, and these chemicals seemed like the sensible answer. What nobody told you, what nobody yet fully knew, was that those same chemicals were slowly being absorbed through the skin night after night. The flame retardant requirement for children's sleepwear had come out of genuine concern. House fires were a real and documented danger, and the idea that a child's pyjamas might catch and hold a flame long enough to cause serious harm was something parents and legislators took seriously. The solution felt like progress. Treat the fabric chemically so that it resisted ignition and children would be safer in their beds. The logic was clean. The intention was good. And for a while, that was the whole story. The chemicals used most widely were called polybrominated biphenyls, a name that meant nothing to the parents folding laundry in the kitchen, and everything to the researchers who eventually began studying what those compounds did once they left the fabric and entered the body. They did not stay on the surface of the cloth. They migrated. They were absorbed through skin contact during the long hours of sleep, accumulating quietly in body tissue over time. Studies began linking them to hormonal disruption. Later research suggested connections to certain cancers. The picture that emerged over years of investigation was far less reassuring than the one that had existed at the point of purchase. The Consumer Products Safety Commission eventually restricted the use of these specific compounds, and manufacturers reformulated. But the reformulation itself raised new questions, because the replacement chemicals were not always better understood than the originals, only more recently introduced, which is a different thing from being proven safe. The cycle of use and concern and restriction and replacement repeated itself in ways that became a longer story about industrial chemistry and the gap between what is approved and what is known. In homes across the country, meanwhile, the old furniture remained. The sofas and armchairs and mattresses purchased in the 1970s and early 80s still held their original chemical treatments, and they continued releasing those compounds into the household air for years afterward. This was not something most families were aware of. The furniture looked fine, it felt fine. It sat in the living room the same way it always had, and nobody thought to connect an armchair to a question about health. The children who wore those pyjamas and sat on those sofas grew up, and eventually heard the news in pieces, years after the fact, through articles and recalls and conversations that assembled the picture slowly. They thought about the little-footed sleepers, the soft flannel, the particular smell of laundry dried on a warm afternoon, and they understood that the safety they had been wrapped in had been more complicated than it appeared. Not careless, not negligent, simply incomplete, the way knowledge is always incomplete at the edge of what a decade has had time to learn. You cannot know what you do not yet know. That is perhaps the simplest thing the 1970s teaches anyone who looks at it carefully. The pyjamas were soft, the children slept soundly, and somewhere in a laboratory the longer story was still being written. It is hard to picture now, but in the 1970s a child could walk into a corner drugstore, set a little money on the counter, and walk out with a pack of cigarettes without anyone blinking. Often they were buying them for a parent who had sent them on an errand. The clerk knew the family, the child knew the brand, and the whole transaction took less time than buying a candy bar. Smoking in the 1970s was not a fringe habit or a private vice. It was the texture of ordinary life. It happened in the kitchen while dinner was on the stove, at the desk during the long hours of homework and bill paying, in the car with the windows rolled halfway down on a summer evening. Cigarettes were on the counter at the gas station, on the table at the diner, in the ashtray on the arm of the sofa where your father sat to watch the news. They were simply present, the way furniture was present, unremarkable and taken entirely for granted. So when a parent needed a pack and had children old enough to make the walk to the drugstore, the errand was no different from sending them for a loaf of bread or a bottle of milk. You were given the money, told the brand, and sent on your way. The person behind the counter did not study your age or ask uncomfortable questions. They knew why you were there. The cigarettes were handed across without ceremony, and you walked back with the change in your pocket and the pack tucked under your arm, and nobody along the way found this remarkable. The stores themselves were organised around cigarettes as a normal category of merchandise. Displays sat at the front near the register where they were easy to reach and easy to buy on impulse. The packaging was not hidden behind opaque screens or kept in locked cases. It was simply there, alongside the aspirin and the chewing gum and the small toys near the door. A child moving through that store saw cigarettes the way they saw everything else on the shelves, as products, available, priced, chosen by adults for reasons that seemed entirely ordinary. Tobacco companies understood this environment well. They had spent decades building a cultural presence that extended into every corner of daily life, and that presence included the stores where families did their everyday shopping. The advertising that surrounded cigarettes, on television until 1971, and in magazines and on billboards long after, presented smoking as something adult and desirable, and children absorbed the vocabulary of desirability early. Candy cigarettes existed for exactly this reason, allowing children to rehearse the gestures of smoking before they were old enough to do it in earnest. And nobody at the time considered this a form of grooming so much as a natural reflection of the culture around them. The push to restrict tobacco sales to minors gained momentum slowly, building across years of research and advocacy and legislative debate. By the time federal law firmly prohibited selling cigarettes to anyone under 18, the world around those laws had already shifted considerably. Smoking rates were falling. Public spaces were going smoke-free one by one. The ashtray that had sat on every restaurant table was disappearing. And the corner drugstore had changed its relationship with tobacco in ways that made the 1970s version of that transaction feel almost impossible to place in the same century. But in 1973, on a Wednesday afternoon, a child walked in with exact change and walked out with what had been asked for, and the door closed behind them with the little bell above it ringing once, and the clerk turned back to whatever they had been doing before. An errand completed, an ordinary moment in an ordinary week. Nothing about it that seemed worth remembering, until the world changed enough to make it strange. In the 1970s, a 12-year-old with a job was not a source of concern. It was a source of pride. Paper routes began before sunrise. Farm work filled the summers. Family businesses expected every able hand, regardless of age. Parents believed deeply, and not without reason, that learning to work young was one of the finest things you could do for a child. that it built something in them that comfort never could. The paper route was perhaps the most iconic version of this. You woke before the rest of the house, in the dark and the quiet, and you folded the papers the way you had been shown, tight and even, and you loaded them into the canvas bag that hung from your handlebars. Then you rode your bike through streets that were still mostly empty, the air cool and smelling of dew and pavement, and you tossed each paper onto each porch with the accuracy that came from doing the same thing every morning until your arm knew the distance without being told. You collected your pay at the end of the week, small and satisfying, and you managed it yourself, spending some, saving some, accounting for it in ways that had nothing to do with school. Farm work was different in scale but similar in spirit. In agricultural communities, children were part of the harvest in ways that were taken entirely for granted. You picked fruit alongside adults in summer heat, or you helped with the animals before and after school, or you ran the smaller equipment once you were old enough to be trusted with it. These were not token contributions. They were real labour, with real physical demands, and they were expected and normal and understood by everyone in the community as part of how children in those families grew up. The Fair Labour Standards Act had been in place since 1938, setting limits on what kinds of work children could do and at what ages. But the enforcement was uneven, and the exceptions were significant, particularly in agriculture, where the rules were considerably more permissive than in other industries. A child could legally perform work on a farm that would not have been permitted in a factory, and in practice the distinction meant that many rural children worked hours and conditions that the law technically allowed without anyone examining too carefully what that allowance cost them. What it sometimes cost was school. A child whose mornings began at 4 for farm work and whose evenings ended late arrived in the classroom already tired, already behind, already carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the lesson on the board. In families where the work was necessary for the household to function, this was not a choice that anyone made lightly. It was simply the arrangement that survival required, and the children who lived it understood that before they were old enough to name it. The arguments that eventually shifted the conversation around child labour were not primarily moral ones, though the moral dimension was always present. They were practical. Children who worked long hours in physically demanding conditions were more likely to be injured, less likely to complete their education, and less equipped for the kinds of adult work that a changing economy increasingly required. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989 placed education at the centre of what childhood was for, and the regulations that followed in the United States reflected that shift. By then, the paper route had already begun to feel like a relic. The world that had made it ordinary, the early mornings and the canvas bag and the coins counted on a kitchen table at the end of the week, was quietly giving way to something else. But for the children who had lived it, the memory stayed clear and specific. The weight of the bag, the cold of the handlebars, the satisfaction of a porch reached and a paper landed just right. Work that was hard and real and entirely their own. If you were a child in the early 1970s, you remember the sound. That sharp, rhythmic clacking, 2 heavy acrylic balls on a string, swung up and down until they smacked together above and below your hand in a blur of speed and noise. The faster you went, the more impressive it looked. The more impressive it looked, the harder you tried. And the harder you tried, the more likely those hard plastic balls were to shatter into flying pieces, or swing wide and catch you somewhere tender. Clackers appeared in toy stores and dime stores, and the kind of casual retail spaces that sold things without much deliberation about what they were selling. They came in various colours and were inexpensive enough to be purchased on impulse, grabbed off a peg near the register on the way out the door. The object was simple. Hold the ring at the top of the string, let the 2 balls hang, and begin the swinging motion that, with practice and persistence, would build into a full rhythm, the balls meeting above and below your hand with satisfying percussive force. The sound they made in a group of children was something between a marching band and a small industrial operation. The skill involved was real. Getting the rhythm took effort. In the beginning you caught the string wrong, or the ball swung unevenly, or they connected at an angle that sent one careening off in an unhelpful direction. But once you had it, once the motion locked into its groove and the clacking became steady and fast, there was a particular pleasure in it that was difficult to explain to anyone watching from outside. It felt like mastery, like something your body had learned to do that your mind had not entirely caught up with yet. The danger was also real, and it arrived in ways that were not always predictable. The acrylic that the balls were made from was not designed to withstand the repeated impact that the toy demanded. It could crack, it could shatter. And when it did, the pieces went quickly and in multiple directions, and there was nothing gentle about them. Children caught fragments in their faces. They caught the solid balls themselves when the rhythm broke, and the weight swung unpredictably. Schools began banning them not as an overreaction, but as a response to what was actually happening in the schoolyards where they were being used. The bans, as they almost always do, made them more desirable. A toy that had been confiscated, that had to be hidden in a jacket pocket and produced only in the right place at the right time, carried a glamour that its unprohibited counterpart could not match. Children found ways around every rule that was put in place, because the clacking was worth it, and because the skill of keeping them going was now also the skill of keeping them hidden, which added its own layer of satisfaction. Manufacturers eventually redesigned them with softer materials and different construction, attempting to keep the appeal while removing the most obvious hazards. But those later versions were never quite the same in the hands of a child who remembered the originals. The weight was different. The sound was different. The particular combination of skill and risk that had made the original clacker so compelling had been engineered away in the interest of safety, which was the right decision and also somehow a small loss. What remained was the memory of that sound sharp and fast in a summer backyard, and the feeling of getting it exactly right, the rhythm locked in, the balls a blur, the whole neighbourhood within earshot of something you had taught yourself to do. Before saccharin, before aspartame, before all the long words on the back of the can that you now read without thinking, there was cyclamate. Through the 1960s and into the early 70s, cyclamate was the sweetener that made diet sodas taste like something approaching pleasure. It was 30 times sweeter than sugar, had no calories and was in everything. And then, almost overnight, it was gone, pulled from American shelves by a government decision that left a generation of diet soda drinkers wondering what exactly they had been drinking. The warning had come from a study released in 1969, the year before cyclamate was officially banned. Researchers had fed laboratory rats extremely high doses of a combination of cyclamate and saccharin, and some of the rats developed bladder tumours. The headlines that followed didn't dwell long on the quantities involved, which were far beyond anything a human being could consume in a normal lifetime of drinking diet soda. What they reported was the conclusion, a possible link to cancer, a substance under suspicion, a government moving to act. By 1970, cyclamate had been removed from the American food supply. The companies that had built products around it adjusted quickly. Tab, one of the most popular diet sodas of the era, reformulated using saccharin, which had its own complicated history and would soon generate its own wave of concern. The shelves reorganized. The cans changed their ingredient lists. Consumers who had developed genuine preferences for the taste of cyclamate-sweetened drinks found themselves drinking something that was close but not quite the same, without any clear explanation of what had changed or why. What made the cyclamate story unusual was not the ban itself, but what came afterward. researchers continued examining the original study, and over the following decades the certainty that had driven the regulatory decision began to soften. The doses used on the rats were reconsidered. The mechanism of harm was questioned. Later reviews of the available evidence suggested the original concern may have been overstated, and the conclusion that cyclamate posed a meaningful risk to humans at normal consumption levels became increasingly difficult to support. Canada and much of Europe never banned it at all, and it remained in common use in those places without producing the outcomes the American ban had been designed to prevent. The United States never reversed the decision. Cyclamate stayed off the American market while the rest of the world used it routinely, a regulatory outcome that became a case study in how the relationship between scientific evidence and public policy can be more complicated than either side of that relationship finds comfortable to admit. In the 1970s, though, most of this was still in the future. What existed in the present was the absence itself, the changed taste of a familiar drink, the quiet disappearance of something that had been ordinary. You reached for your diet soda and drank what was in the can, trusting that the people responsible for such decisions had made a careful and well-founded one. That trust was not entirely misplaced, only incomplete, the way most trust tends to be when the science is still assembling itself, and the headlines are moving faster than the evidence. The can was cold, the drink was sweet, and somewhere in a government file, a decision that would last decades had already been made on your behalf, with all the certainty that a single study and a particular moment in time could produce. Before 1971, you could settle into the sofa on a weeknight, watching your favourite programme, and between segments, a rugged cowboy would appear on screen to light a cigarette in the golden light of an open range. The Marlboro Man looked at you through the television with perfect calm, and what you felt was not alarm. What you felt was something closer to aspiration. Cigarette advertising was not fringe content in the 1970s. It was prime time. The ban on television and radio cigarette advertising went into effect on January 2nd, 1971, the day after the last cigarette commercials aired on New Year's Day, a timing that felt almost ceremonial. The closing of one era and the opening of another. But the ban did not silence the tobacco industry. It redirected it. The money that had been flowing into television production moved almost immediately into magazines, billboards, event sponsorships, and the careful placement of cigarettes into Hollywood films, where an actor holding one at a certain angle could accomplish in a single scene what a 30-second commercial might have taken several airings to achieve. The magazines of the 1970s were thick with tobacco advertising, in a way that is difficult to fully picture now. Full-page spreads in the kind of publications that sat on coffee tables and in waiting rooms and on kitchen counters. The imagery was consistent. Wide landscapes, confident figures, the suggestion of a life lived freely and without apology. Newport gave you freshness and menthol and the outdoor feeling of a cigarette break taken in the right company. Virginia Slims told a particular story about women and independence and modernity that arrived at exactly the moment when those themes were reshaping American culture from the inside. Children grew up surrounded by all of this in a way that shaped what smoking looked like before they were old enough to decide what they thought about it. By the time you were a teenager with your own opinions, the visual vocabulary of cigarettes had been in your environment for as long as you could remember. You had seen the cowboy. You had seen the couple laughing on the sailboat. You had seen the athlete with a cigarette in hand, which required a particular kind of advertising audacity that the era permitted without much resistance. The companies were also present at sporting events, their names on the cars driving the fastest circuits, their logos on the scoreboards of arenas, their hospitality tents at the tournaments where the best seats came with free samples and a brand representative happy to answer any question you did not already know the answer to. Formula One and cigarette branding became so intertwined during this period that separating them required not just a regulatory change but a restructuring of how the sport thought about its own identity. By the time the 1970s gave way to the next decade, the tobacco industry had demonstrated something important. The form of advertising mattered far less than the cultural presence it created, and cultural presence could be maintained through channels that no single law had thought to address. The television ban had changed the screen without changing the air, and the air in 1970s America still carried the particular smell of an industry that had not yet begun to lose. But on that last night before the ban, someone sat on a sofa and watched the Marlboro Man ride across the screen one final time in prime time, and did not yet know that anything was ending. The programme returned after the commercial, the evening continued, and outside the neon of a tobacco billboard glowed quietly against the winter dark. Step onto a commercial flight in 1974, and the air would tell you immediately where you were. Thick and faintly blue, smelling of tobacco and jet fuel and the particular staleness of recycled cabin air, it wrapped around every passenger, regardless of where they sat. There were smoking sections, technically, but the smoke did not honour the invisible line drawn on the seating chart. It drifted where it pleased, and so you breathed it either way for the full length of the flight, somewhere above the clouds with an ashtray built into the armrest beside you. Flying in the 1970s still carried a residue of the glamour that had belonged to aviation in earlier decades. People dressed for it. Not formally, not the way they had in the 1950s, but with a care that signalled the occasion. The flight attendants, still called stewardesses in many contexts and still subject to appearance standards that would not survive the decade unchanged, moved through the aisles with a practised efficiency that the environment required. The cabins were full, the flights were long, and the smoking was as unremarkable as the meals served on real dishes at the beginning of the flight. The cigarette was something to do at altitude. It occupied the hands during the hours when there was nothing to look at outside but cloud and the occasional glimpse of a city laid out in miniature below. Passengers lit up shortly after takeoff, during the beverage service, after the meal, during the long middle stretch of a transcontinental flight when the novelty had worn off and the arrival still felt far away. The smoke rose and mingled and went nowhere in particular, because there was nowhere for it to go in the sealed tube of a commercial aircraft except into the lungs of everyone present. The flight attendants who worked those cabins spent their careers in that air. The passengers who flew regularly accumulated a lifetime of passive exposure that nobody was measuring or tracking in any systematic way, because the framework for thinking about second-hand smoke as a distinct and documentable health risk was still being assembled. The Surgeon General's reports on smoking's dangers had been arriving since 1964, but the focus was on the smoker, and the understanding of what the smoke did to the people around the smoker was following at a slower pace. The first restriction came in 1988, when short domestic flights in the United States went smoke-free. The change was specific and limited, but it established a principle that had not previously existed in aviation, that a passenger's right to smoke ended where another passenger's air began. The principle expanded quickly. By 1990, all domestic flights in the United States were smoke-free. By 2000, the prohibition covered international flights as well, and the ashtrays that had been built into every armrest became vestigial objects, kept in place because removing them from certified aircraft required more regulatory effort than leaving them, but serving no purpose any passenger would ever use. The cabin smelled different after that, cleaner, in a way that passengers who had only ever flown in the new era would not have recognised as a change but simply as the baseline. For those who remembered the other version, the blue haze and the particular smell of a long flight before the rules changed, the new air was an absence, a thing removed. the shape of something that had been ordinary for so long that its disappearance required a small adjustment to what flying felt like. You arrived at your destination, and your clothes did not smell like the flight. That was new, small, and easy to overlook, and entirely new. In the 1970s, a freshly painted room smelled like progress, like a new start. You rolled it on the walls of the nursery, the kitchen, the hallway, and you stood back and felt satisfied with how clean and bright everything looked. Lead-based paint had been on walls across America for decades, durable and colourful and completely unremarkable. The danger it carried was invisible, which made it the most ordinary kind of danger, the kind nobody thought to question. The paint went on smoothly and dried to a hard, bright finish that held up against the scuffs and smudges of daily life in a way that other products could not quite match. Manufacturers had been adding lead compounds to paint since the early part of the century, because lead improved the colour, the adhesion, and the durability in ways that made the product genuinely superior by the standards available at the time. Homes were painted with it, schools were painted with it, cribs were painted with it in colours soft enough for a nursery, and children ran their hands along those rails and pressed their faces against those surfaces, and nobody considered that the surface itself might be the problem. The research that changed the conversation had been accumulating quietly for years before it reached the attention of the general public. Scientists studying lead poisoning in children had begun connecting the dots between elevated blood lead levels and the presence of deteriorating painted surfaces in older homes. The paint that chipped and peeled released dust that settled on floors, on windowsills, on the hands of children who then put those hands in their mouths with the routine thoroughness of young children everywhere. The ingestion was small each time and constant over months and years, and the effects it produced were not always visible in the way that an obvious illness is visible. Lead affects the developing brain in ways that emerge slowly and are easily attributed to other causes. Children with elevated blood lead levels showed developmental delays, learning difficulties, shortened attention spans, and behavioural changes that their families and teachers noticed without having any framework to connect to what was on the walls around them. The damage was quiet and cumulative, and by the time it was recognised for what it was, it had already happened in homes across the country over the course of generations. The federal government banned lead-based paint for residential use in 1978. The ban was significant and overdue, and also, in a practical sense, incomplete, because banning the future use of something does nothing about the surfaces it has already been applied to. Millions of homes built before 1978 still had their original paint, layered under decades of repainting, intact and stable, when left alone but dangerous the moment it was disturbed. Renovation projects, the kind that involved sanding and scraping and drilling into old walls, could release lead dust in quantities that turned a home improvement into a health event. Families who had grown up in those houses, who had pressed their palms against those walls and played on those floors and breathed that dust without knowing it, learned about the risk in pieces, over years, through news reports and public health campaigns, and the slow accumulation of evidence that reshaped what ordinary childhood environments were understood to have been. It was not a comfortable reckoning. The houses had felt safe. They had been home, and the paint had looked exactly like paint. What the 1970s leaves behind on this subject is not a story of carelessness, but of the particular way that widespread harm can hide inside the familiar. Lead paint was not a secret kept from the public by bad actors, though the industry's resistance to regulation deserves its own accounting. It was a product that had been in use long enough to feel inevitable, trusted long enough to stop being examined, and defended long enough that the evidence against it had to become overwhelming before the official response arrived. The children who grew up in those painted rooms are adults now. Most of them are fine, or fine enough, in the way that people are fine when the damage is diffuse and the comparison point does not exist. They painted their own children's rooms with different paint in a different era, and they stood back and felt the same satisfaction at the clean, bright walls, not knowing quite what it meant that this version was safer, only that it was, and that the knowing had been earned at a cost that nobody had agreed to pay. In the 1970s, lawn darts were a backyard staple. Families and friends would gather outside, taking turns hurling large metal-tipped darts toward a circular target on the grass. The game seemed innocent enough, like horseshoes but with high-flying projectiles. However, the reality was far more dangerous. These darts weren't lightweight toys. They were heavy and sharp enough to pierce the ground and, unfortunately, sometimes people. A misplaced throw or a distracted child wandering into the game zone could result in serious injuries and, tragically, even fatalities. The darts themselves had a satisfying weight in your hand. You gripped the plastic fin at the back, felt the heft of the metal tip pulling downward, and there was something deeply physical about the throw, the arc of it, the release at exactly the right moment, the way the dart climbed and turned and descended toward the ring in the grass. When it landed inside the target, the impact made a solid sound, a thunk of metal meeting earth, and there was a particular pleasure in that sound that the game's designers had understood instinctively. It was a game built around the satisfying physics of a heavy object travelling through summer air. The sets came in boxes that depicted families playing together on green lawns in warm afternoon light, the kind of advertising image that communicated safety through cheerfulness. Parents bought them at hardware stores and department stores without reading anything beyond the age recommendation on the box. The game had the feel of something traditional, something your own father might have played, a backyard ritual passed down through the logic of warm weather and open space, and the need to do something with your hands while the grill heated up. The problem was the combination of weight, sharpness, and the unpredictable nature of a backyard game involving children of different ages and attention spans. The rings that served as targets sat on the ground, which meant players were throwing toward a point at ground level, which meant the arc of a dart carried it through the space where people stood and moved and turned away at the wrong moment. A child who wandered in from the side yard following a dog or chasing a ball entered the game zone without announcement. A throw already in the air could not be recalled. Injuries were reported steadily through the decade. Emergency rooms saw the cases and hospitals documented them, and the pattern accumulated in medical literature and regulatory files with the slow momentum of evidence that has not yet reached critical mass. The Consumer Product Safety Commission received warnings and reviewed the data and moved with the deliberateness of a body that must balance risk against the considerable reality of a product that millions of families already owned and actively used and considered harmless because they had been using it for years without incident. The ban came in 1988, following a series of severe accidents that included fatalities. The Commission's decision was nearly absolute. Lawn darts as they existed, with their metal tips and their design trajectory, were banned from sale in the United States. Manufacturers were required to pull existing inventory. The game effectively ended in its original form, replaced eventually by a blunt-tipped version that sacrificed the authentic physics of the throw for the practical benefit of not being dangerous. For those who'd grown up playing the original game, the ban arrived with the particular dissonance of learning that something you had loved was also something that had hurt people. The afternoons had been good, the throws had been satisfying, the ring in the grass had been a worthy target. None of that was false, and none of it cancelled out the other truth, which was that the dart was heavy, and the tip was sharp, and the backyard was full of people who were not always watching the sky. At the end of a Saturday night in the early 1970s, people said their goodbyes, gathered their coats, and walked to their cars, and most of them had been drinking. This was not scandalous. It was not even particularly noticed. The social stigma around drunk driving was minimal in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the distance of the present. Many people believed, with complete sincerity, that they drove better with a little alcohol in them, that it loosened the nerves, steadied the hands, made them more relaxed behind the wheel. The legal framework supported this tolerance in practical terms. Blood alcohol concentration limits in many states sat at 0.10% or higher, and enforcement was inconsistent enough that even those limits functioned more as theoretical boundaries than as real deterrents. An officer who pulled over a driver and smelled alcohol might issue a warning, might suggest the driver park for a while and sober up, might let them go with a word of caution and a genuine expectation that the driver would be more careful the rest of the way home. The idea that a night in jail was the appropriate response to having driven after several drinks had not yet settled into the culture as common sense. Parties ended and cars filled, and the roads absorbed all of it without much comment. The host who had served the drinks did not feel a particular responsibility for what happened after the guests left the driveway. The guests who had been drinking did not feel that accepting a ride was something they needed to insist on. The friend group that watched someone get behind the wheel after an evening at the bar understood this as a personal decision made by an adult, and the social cost of intervening was higher than the social cost of saying nothing. The blood alcohol limits that existed were difficult to feel from the inside, which was part of the problem. A person who had consumed enough alcohol to reach 0.10% did not necessarily feel impaired in a way that announced itself clearly. The confidence that alcohol produces in moderate amounts felt like competence, and the distinction between those two things was not something the body reliably communicated. You felt fine. You had driven home this way before. You knew the route. These were the reassurances that a Saturday night in the 1970s provided, and they were reassurances that the road accepted until it did not. The turning point is associated most directly with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, founded in 1980 by Candace Lightner after her 13-year-old daughter was killed by a repeat drunk driving offender. The organisation brought grief into the public conversation in a way that statistics alone had not managed to do. It gave the issue a face and a name and a persistence that legislative hearings and medical reports had not produced. The campaign that followed was not just about changing the law, though it changed the law. It was about changing what the culture considered acceptable, which is a slower and harder thing, and also the thing that ultimately matters more. By the time the legal drinking age was restored to 21 in 1984, and the blood alcohol limits began their gradual tightening, the conversation around drunk driving had already shifted in ways that were visible in ordinary life. The host who had served the drinks began to feel responsible for what happened after. The friend who watched someone reach for their keys began to feel that saying something was not an intrusion, but an obligation. The road home at midnight began to feel like a shared space rather than a private one. The Saturday nights were the same, the parties were the same, the goodbyes at the door were the same. What changed was the walk to the car, and what it meant to take it. In the early 1970s, flying was still a relatively dressed-up affair. You wore something presentable to the airport. The gates were open. Friends and family could walk all the way to the plane door to say goodbye or to be there the moment someone stepped off the jetway. There were no long lines, no belts coming off, no shoes removed, no questions about what was in your carry-on. You simply walked in and went where you needed to go. The airport in those years had a different quality of feeling. It was a public space in the fullest sense, open to anyone who wanted to be in it for any reason, and the crowds that moved through it reflected that openness. Families came to see someone off and stayed until the plane backed away from the gate. children pressed their faces against the terminal windows to watch the aircraft taxi out onto the runway, and this was simply what you did on the afternoon someone you loved was leaving for somewhere far away. The airport was a place for the whole experience of departure, not just the boarding itself. The security measures that existed were minimal and focused on the most obvious threats. Metal detectors had been introduced at some airports following a surge in hijackings in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and passengers were sometimes asked to pass through them. But the checks were inconsistent and the screening was not the systematic and universal process it would later become. You moved through the airport at a pace that assumed your legitimacy and the legitimacy of everyone around you as the default condition rather than something to be demonstrated. The hijackings that prompted even these modest measures were real and documented. The decades that followed saw the lead content of American gasoline remain essentially unchallenged, while the cars burning it multiplied, and the highways expanded, and the air above them carried what the combustion produced. The research that eventually forced action came from multiple directions. Studies of blood lead levels in the American population showed concentrations that were far higher than in populations with less automotive exposure. Research on children living near busy roads documented elevated lead levels and associated developmental effects. The connection between atmospheric lead from automotive exhaust and the lead accumulating in human bodies was not difficult to establish once the question was being asked with the right instruments and the right intention. The Environmental Protection Agency, created in 1970, began the process of phasing out leaded gasoline in 1973, requiring the introduction of unleaded fuel and mandating that new vehicles be equipped with catalytic converters that required unleaded fuel to function properly. The phase-out was gradual, contested at points by industry interests, and extended over more than 2 decades before leaded gasoline for on-road use was effectively eliminated in the United States in 1996. The results of that phase-out were measurable and significant. Blood lead levels in the American population fell dramatically over the years following the transition, tracking the decline in atmospheric lead with the kind of directness that epidemiologists rarely get to observe. The air above the highways cleared in ways that instruments could document, and that the eyes could almost perceive on a still day over a city that had once carried a permanent haze from the millions of engines burning what the pumps had always dispensed. The sky above the highway is cleaner now than it was in 1972. That fact sits quietly inside every drive taken today, unremarked upon because the comparison point is gone from living memory for most drivers. But the numbers clicked on the pump that Tuesday afternoon, and the nozzle smelled the way it always smelled, and the car pulled back onto the road and added its contribution to an atmosphere that was keeping a long and invisible account. In a certain kind of high school in the 1970s, there was a place known simply as the smoking area. It was often a corner of the courtyard, sometimes a bench near the side entrance, always slightly apart from where the teachers lingered. Students stood there between classes with cigarettes in hand, and nobody came to send them away. The school had decided, with a pragmatism that feels almost surreal now, that it was better to give them a designated space than to pretend the habit did not exist. The reasoning behind the smoking area was not without its own internal logic. Administrators who had grown up in a world where smoking was ordinary understood that students who smoked were going to smoke whether the school permitted it or not. The alternative to a designated area was not an absence of smoking, but rather smoking in bathrooms, behind the gymnasium, in parked cars across the street from campus, in places that were harder to supervise and easier to combine with other behaviours that the school was less willing to accommodate. The smoking area was, in its way, a harm reduction strategy, though nobody would have used that language at the time. Teachers smoke too, and in many schools they did so without much concern for what this communicated to the students watching them. The teacher's lounge in the 1970s was often a room thick with cigarette smoke, a space where adults retreated between periods to smoke and talk and decompress from the demands of the classroom. The smell drifted under the door and into the hallway, and students who passed by understood intuitively that smoking was simply part of adult life, something you did when you needed a moment, something that belonged to the small rituals of getting through a long day. The students who gathered in the smoking area between classes did so with a social ease that was entirely consistent with the culture they'd been raised inside. Many of them had watched their parents smoke at the kitchen table every morning. They had ridden in cars where the windows were cracked against the smoke, and the ashtray on the dashboard filled steadily over the course of a family trip. Cigarettes had been the backdrop of their childhoods in a way that made the transition to smoking their own feel less like a decision and more like an arrival at something already familiar. The minimum age for purchasing cigarettes existed in a technical sense, but enforcement was loose enough that most students who wanted to smoke had little difficulty obtaining cigarettes. Corner stores and gas stations, where the clerks knew the neighbourhood, did not apply rigid scrutiny to a teenager with the right money and the right brand name ready on their lips. The cigarettes came home in jacket pockets and were distributed in the smoking area with the casual generosity of people sharing something that was simply available. The legal and regulatory changes that ended the school smoking area arrived gradually across the 1980s and into the 90s, as the understanding of both direct and second-hand smoke risk made the idea of a designated student smoking area increasingly untenable. Schools went smoke-free, then the surrounding grounds went smoke-free, and the corner of the courtyard that had once hosted the daily ritual of students standing together in the particular camaraderie that shared habits produce became just another corner of a schoolyard, unremarkable and empty of its former purpose. What remained was the memory of it, specific and sensory for anyone who had been there. The smell of that corner, the particular light of a morning break, the way a group of students could stand together in companionable silence, with nothing more in common than the habit that had brought them to the same patch of concrete at the same time every day. Every child who wanted one knew the Easy Bake Oven by sight, that pastel little appliance sitting on the toy store shelf like a promise of miniature cakes and real baking, and the particular satisfaction of making something yourself. And it did work. The tiny bulb inside got genuinely, impressively hot. Hot enough to bake, hot enough to burn, hot enough that a small finger reaching in at the wrong moment would remember the lesson for years, though in the 1970s this was considered somewhere between an acceptable risk and a useful lesson about paying attention. The box it came in showed a child smiling at a tiny finished cake, and that image was accurate enough as far as it went. The cakes were real. The process was real. You mixed the powder with water the way the instructions said, poured it into the small pan, slid it into the slot at the front of the oven, and waited while the bulb inside did its work. The waiting was its own particular experience, a small exercise in patience that felt enormous at the age of 7. The smell of something actually baking rising from the little appliance on the playroom table, the anticipation of something you had made yourself arriving in miniature form on a tiny foil plate. The temperature the bulb produced was not symbolic. Standard incandescent bulbs of the wattage used in the Easy Bake Oven generated enough heat to reach temperatures that genuine baking requires, which is what made the toy work and also what made it capable of causing real burns to the small hands operating it. The slot that the baking pan slid through was sized for the pan, not for fingers, but fingers have a way of going where the design did not intend, especially in the eager and impatient hands of a child waiting for something to be finished. Burns were reported, not in numbers that would make headlines, but steadily enough that the pattern was there for anyone looking at emergency room data with the right questions in mind. Children who reached in too far, who misjudged the position of the heating element, who pulled the pan out without the proper tool, received burns that were genuine and in some cases serious. Parents treated them at home with the remedies of the era, or took the child to a doctor, and most of the time the injury healed and the Easy Bake Oven went back onto the playroom shelf and was used again the following Saturday. The toy persisted through these decades because its appeal was genuine, and its fundamental premise, allowing a child to bake real food with real heat, was exactly what children wanted from it. The danger was considered a feature of the learning process rather than a defect in the product design. Children were expected to develop a respect for heat through encounters with it, the same way they developed a respect for scissors and bicycles and the edge of the swimming pool. The Easy Bake Oven taught you that the oven was hot. If the lesson arrived through a burn on your fingertip, that was understood as the lesson working. By the early 2000s, safety standards for children's products had evolved enough that the original design could no longer be sold unchanged. The incandescent bulb that had heated the oven for decades was replaced with an enclosed heating element that provided controlled warmth without the same risk of direct contact. The newer version worked and was safer and satisfied regulators and parents who had grown up in a different relationship with acceptable risk than the one the original Easy Bake Oven had been born into. For the children of the 1970s who remembered the original, the toy lived in memory as something that was genuinely theirs, something that worked and required care and rewarded patience and occasionally, just occasionally, reminded you with a sharp, specific heat that the appliance you were playing with was not entirely playing. On a long family drive in 1973, the back seat was an open country. Children stretched out across the bench, leaned against the windows, knelt on the floor to look out the rear windshield, or simply moved around as the mood took them. Seatbelts were present in many cars by then, coiled against the seat like suggestions rather than rules. Adults in the front usually buckled up. Children in the back usually did not. This was simply the arrangement, as unremarkable as the radio playing and the windows rolled halfway down. The belief systems that sustained this arrangement were varied and genuinely held. Some adults believed that a seat belt could trap you in a wrecked car, that the danger of being unable to exit quickly outweighed the protection the belt offered during impact. Others felt that the discomfort of the belt across the chest, the way it wrinkled clothing and restricted movement over a long drive, was a reasonable trade for the freedom of sitting unbuckled. Others simply had not thought about it carefully, because thinking about it carefully would have required a framework for imagining what actually happened to an unbelted body during a sudden stop, and that framework had not yet been provided to most people in terms they could picture and take seriously. The car itself was built around assumptions that matched the culture. Bench seats ran the full width of the vehicle, creating a space in the back that felt genuinely expansive to a child accustomed to smaller rooms. The floor was flat and carpeted. The rear window was large and offered a view that a child lying on their back could watch for miles, the sky and the tops of overpasses and the occasional bird moving against the blue. A long drive was a kind of portable room, and the freedom to move around it was part of what made a long drive bearable for children who had no other way to manage the hours. This safety research existed and had been accumulating since the 1950s, when automotive engineers and public health researchers began documenting in careful detail what unrestrained bodies did during collisions of various speeds and angles. The data was not ambiguous. The physics of an unbelted passenger in a sudden stop described an outcome that was measurable and consistent and entirely preventable with the technology already installed in the vehicle. The information existed. The belts existed. The gap between those two facts and the behavior of the people in the back seat was a gap filled entirely by culture. New York became the first state to pass a mandatory seatbelt law in 1984, requiring front seat occupants to buckle up. other states followed with varying degrees of speed and enthusiasm, and the debates that accompanied each legislative effort revealed how deeply the resistance ran. The arguments against mandatory belt laws included personal freedom, government overreach, and the persistent belief among many drivers that they were capable of making their own risk assessments without legislative assistance. These were not fringe arguments. They were mainstream positions held by legislators and ordinary citizens alike, which is part of why the change took as long as it did. By the 1990s, the shift was largely complete, and the seatbelt had moved from suggestion to social norm to legal requirement in a way that made the back seat of a family car look entirely different from the open country it had been 20 years earlier. Children sat upright and buckled. The bench seat was still there in older cars, but the movement across it was gone, replaced by the particular stillness of a body held in place and the miles passing outside the window. The radio still played. The windows were still halfway down in summer. Everything else about the back seat had changed, and what it had changed into was safer by every measure available, and somehow also smaller. Back in the 1970s, child car seat laws were practically non-existent. Most parents relied on standard seat belts to keep their children secure, and many didn't even do that. It was common to see kids bouncing around the back seat, lying across the bench, or even standing up while the car was in motion. Some parents placed babies in makeshift carriers or simply held them in their laps, believing that their grip alone would keep them safe in an accident. The logic of holding a baby in your arms during a car trip felt sound in the way that many things feel sound before the specific physics of the situation are laid out in terms that cannot be set aside. You were there, you were paying attention, your arms were strong and your instincts were reliable, and you had been driving this route for years. If something happened, you would respond the way you always responded to anything that required a rapid response, by tightening your grip and protecting what mattered. This was the reasoning of a person who loved their child completely and had never been shown a diagram of what happens to an unrestrained infant during a 30-mile-per-hour collision. Car seats existed in the 1970s, but their design and their purpose were different from what they would become. Many models were constructed to prop a child up at a height that allowed them to see out the window, to keep them contained within a seat rather than roaming the back of the vehicle, to make the trip more manageable for the adults in the front. The concept of crash protection, of designing a seat specifically to absorb and redirect the forces of a collision in a way that preserved the small body inside it, was present in some products, but not central to the category as a whole. You bought a car seat to manage a toddler on a long drive. The safety benefit was secondary in the minds of most buyers and many manufacturers. The data that shifted this was gathered and published across the 1970s and early 80s, documenting with increasing precision what car crashes were doing to children and what the difference looked like when a proper safety seat was present. The findings were difficult to argue with. A correctly installed car seat reduced the risk of fatal injury by more than half for toddlers, and by even more for infants. The seat did something that parental arms could not do, not because parents were insufficient, but because the physics of a collision happened faster than human reflex, and with forces that no grip can counter. States began passing child restraint laws through the late 1970s and early 1980s, Tennessee becoming the first in 1978. The laws that followed varied in their specifics, the ages they covered, the types of restraints they required, the penalties they imposed, but the direction was consistent. By the mid-1980s, every state had some form of child restraint requirement on the books, and the industry producing the seats responded with products that took the safety function seriously in their design and testing. The infant in the parent's lap became, over those years, a less visible sight on American roads. Not immediately, not completely, but steadily, and then decisively. The front seat held the baby in a rear-facing seat now, or the back seat did, and the parent drove with both hands on the wheel and a different kind of attention, the kind that comes from knowing the child behind you is held by something stronger than love and faster than reflex. The drives were the same length. The roads were the same. The baby still needed tending at rest stops and still fell asleep to the motion of the highway, the way babies always have. What changed was what held them while they slept, and what would hold them if the drive suddenly became something other than a drive. In the 1970s, keeping exotic pets like iguanas, macaws, and even boa constrictors was surprisingly common and largely unregulated. Unlike today, when permits and strict guidelines are in place, back then people could walk into a pet store and buy a monkey, a parrot, or even a big cat without much scrutiny. No special paperwork was required. No permit, no inspection, no one asking whether your home was suitable for a creature that had never been domesticated. You saw it, you wanted it, and if you had the money, you could take it home. The pet stores that carried exotic animals in the 1970s occupied a particular place in the retail landscape, somewhere between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Shops where the smell of cedar shavings and animal warmth hit you as you pushed through the door, and where the back of the store might hold something that made you stop and look twice. A cage with a small primate inside, a tank with a snake of considerable length coiled against the glass, a macaw on a perch that watched you with an intelligence that was genuinely unsettling in the way that intelligence in a non-human face always is when you encounter it without preparation. The people who bought these animals were not uniformly irresponsible. Many of them loved what they brought home with a sincerity that was real and lasting. They read what was available to read, which was not always much, and they set up enclosures and feeding routines and gave the animal a life that was genuinely cared for within the limits of what a suburban house in 1974 could provide for a creature whose biology had been shaped by a continent it would never see. The love was real, the knowledge was incomplete, and the gap between those two things produced outcomes that were, in many cases, entirely foreseeable in retrospect. Exotic animals that outgrew their enclosures or became too difficult to manage were sometimes released, which in Florida and other warm states contributed to invasive species problems that became ecological concerns of real magnitude. The Burmese python, which would eventually establish a significant and destructive population in the Florida Everglades, arrived partly through this route, through animals purchased as manageable juveniles that became unmanageable adults. The animals that were not released were sometimes surrendered to facilities that had not budgeted for them, or kept in conditions that did not serve them, or passed between owners with diminishing levels of investment in their welfare. The US Fish and Wildlife Service began introducing regulations in the 1980s, and state laws followed across the following decades, gradually closing the open market that had existed for most of the century. The permits and inspections and care standards that now govern the ownership of exotic animals represent a regulatory architecture that would have seemed excessive in the 1970s to anyone standing in front of a pet store tank trying to decide whether a boa constrictor would fit in their spare bedroom. The spare bedroom was almost certainly not the right answer, but the creature in the tank was compelling, and the door to the store was open, and the decade had not yet developed the habit of asking what would happen 5 years from now when the animal was considerably larger and considerably less novelty and considerably more need. In the 1970s, there were families who would drive out to a farm on a Saturday morning specifically for raw milk, unpasteurized, unprocessed, still faintly warm from the morning milking and poured into glass bottles with paper lids. People believed in it with a quiet conviction that this was the real thing, the way milk tasted before the machinery got involved, and that something valuable was preserved in its unaltered state. The bacteria that could also be present in its unaltered state was not yet the centre of the conversation. The farm itself was part of the appeal. You turned off the main road onto a gravel drive and the landscape changed around you. The suburban grid giving way to open fields and the particular smell of a working agricultural property, earth and hay and animals and the clean cold air that seemed to come from a different atmosphere entirely than the one above the parking lots and strip malls you had left behind. Children who came along on these trips remembered the experience as vividly as anything from their childhoods. The sound of gravel under the tyres, the way a barn looked in early morning light, the unhurried quality of the transaction at the farm stand where the bottles waited in a cooler, and the farmer knew the regulars by name. The milk itself tasted different from what came in the cardboard carton at the grocery store, and this difference was real, not imagined. Raw milk retains the cream in its natural distribution throughout the liquid, and the flavour of that fat, unhomogenized and unaltered by heat, carries a richness that pasteurized milk does not quite replicate. People who grew up drinking raw milk from a particular farm developed a specific memory of that taste, and the grocery store version, for all its convenience and consistency, never fully satisfied the comparison. The bottle from the farm was heavier, colder, more particular. It tasted like somewhere. Farmers who sold directly to consumers operated in a regulatory environment that varied considerably by state and often by county, a patchwork of rules that reflected the long history of small-scale dairy farming in American agriculture. In many places the sale was legal and unquestioned, a transaction between a farmer and a neighbour that the mimicry was precise because the model was everywhere, and the observation was constant, and children are exceptionally good at absorbing and reproducing the physical grammar of the world they inhabit. The taste of the candy itself was simple and sweet, a chalky sugar stick with a flavour that was closer to conversation hearts than to anything else, mild and faintly vanilla, and designed for easy consumption rather than any particular complexity. But the taste was not the point. The point was the holding of it, the way it looked between your fingers, the way you could tilt your head and gesture with it the way the adults did, the particular feeling of performing something adult in miniature. Childhood has always involved this kind of rehearsal, the trying on of grown-up behaviours in a form scaled to your size and stripped of their actual consequences. And in the 1970s, the adult behaviour most available for rehearsal, most present in the visual environment, most normalised by every medium a child consumed, was smoking. The adults who bought candy cigarettes for children did not experience this as a troubling choice. They had grown up in a world where cigarettes were ordinary, and where the idea that a child pretending to smoke was being prepared for actual smoking seemed like an overreach of concern, an attribution of consequence to something that was simply play. The candy was sweet. The children were happy. The checkout counter at the corner store was where small pleasures were purchased without overthinking, and the candy cigarette was one of them, sitting in its little box between the bubble gum and the wax bottles filled with coloured syrup, unremarkable and entirely at home. The criticism that eventually attached itself to candy cigarettes followed the broader cultural shift in how smoking was understood and discussed in public life. As the health consequences of tobacco became less deniable, and the tobacco industry's deliberate cultivation of young smokers became more documented and more publicly known, the question of whether a candy designed to make smoking look appealing and natural to children was an innocent product began to receive different answers than it had in the 1970s. The argument that candy cigarettes normalised smoking for children, that they made the gestures familiar and the imagery comfortable before a child was old enough to evaluate the actual thing, gained traction in the same years that tobacco advertising was being pushed out of more and more public spaces. Many countries moved to restrict or ban them, requiring that the cigarette imagery be removed from the packaging, that the product be sold without the paper wrapper, that the name be changed to something that did not so directly invoke the thing it had always been pretending to be. In the United States, the products continued to be sold in modified forms, the branding softened, the cigarette-specific imagery reduced, the boxes redesigned in ways that maintain the candy while distancing it somewhat from the original concept. What remained, for those who remembered the original version, was the specific memory of the checkout counter and the little box and the powdered sugar cloud that rose when you blew on the tip, and the feeling of walking out of the store holding something that made you feel, for a moment, considerably older than you were. It was a small pleasure of a specific time, inseparable from the larger cultural fact that had made it possible, the fact that smoking in the 1970s was so thoroughly woven into ordinary life that even the candy aisle could not entirely escape its shape. In the 1970s, the family medicine cabinet was a different kind of place. It held aspirin in doses that would make a modern pharmacist pause, cough syrups with ingredients long since removed from the market, and tonics recommended by doctors who were working from a science that was still catching up with itself. You took what the label said, and you trusted what the doctor prescribed, because the system around you told you that these things had been considered and approved, and that was generally enough. The cabinet itself was a small mirror-fronted box mounted above the bathroom sink, and its contents were a kind of household pharmacopoeia assembled over time without much systematic thought. Bottles of varying sizes stood in loose rows behind the mirror, their labels faded at the edges, some of them holdovers from years past that nobody had gotten around to discarding. There was aspirin in large bottles, the full adult dose recommended freely for children in quantities that pediatric medicine would later reconsider significantly, particularly after research connected aspirin use in children with viral illnesses to a rare but serious condition called Ray's syndrome. The connection was established in the early 1980s, and the recommendations changed, and the large bottles of aspirin in the children's doses disappeared from the cabinet with the quiet efficiency of a risk that had been identified too late to undo what had already been done. Cough syrups in the 1970s contained ingredients that addressed the symptom with a directness that later regulatory review would find excessive. Codeine appeared in formulations sold over the counter for children, a choice that reflected a period in pharmaceutical regulation when the threshold for including controlled substances in consumer products was calibrated differently than it would later become. The syrup worked. It quieted coughs and allowed sleep in a way that parents found genuinely useful during the long nights of childhood illness. The mechanism by which it worked, and what that mechanism meant for a small body taking it regularly, was a question that the label did not fully address, and that most families did not think to ask. Patent medicines occupied a respected place in the cabinet alongside the more conventional pharmaceuticals. Tonics and elixirs with names that promised restoration and vitality had been part of American domestic medicine for generations, and the 1970s version of this tradition was a collection of products that occupied the space between food and drug without being fully regulated as either. You took them when you felt run down, or when the season changed, or when someone in the house had been sick and you wanted to do something preventive, and the doing of something was itself a comfort that the product provided regardless of what its active ingredients were actually accomplishing. The pharmacist at the corner drugstore knew the family and had opinions about what worked and what did not, offered in the practical, unhurried way of someone who'd been dispensing advice alongside prescriptions for decades. This relationship, personal and particular, was itself a form of regulation that existed outside the official systems, a check provided by a knowledgeable human being who could look at the person across the counter and say that one is fine or try this instead, with a confidence built from years of watching the neighbourhood take its medicine and either recover or not. The regulatory framework that governed pharmaceuticals was tightened considerably through the 1980s and beyond, driven by a combination of scientific advances, documented harms, and the organizational capacity of consumer advocacy groups who had developed the ability to translate research findings into legislative pressure. Ingredients were reviewed and removed. Dosing recommendations for children were separated from adult recommendations with a specificity that earlier generations of labels had not attempted. The cabinet was reorganized by forces that mostly operated invisibly, through changes to what manufacturers were permitted to include and how they were required to describe it. What remained in the modern cabinet is safer by measurable standards, though it is also in some ways a less inhabited space, less full of the particular bottles and their particular claims, less redolent of the mixture of faith and pragmatism that stocked it in the 1970s. The mirror still opens on the same kind of hinge, the aspirin is still there, but the cabinet it opens onto has been quietly, thoroughly rearranged. In the 1970s, the instruction a child received on a summer morning was simple. Go outside. The rest was up to you. You rode your bike to the creek, climbed the trees at the edge of the vacant lot, played in the irrigation ditch, wandered the neighborhood in a loose group that formed and reformed through the day without anyone's parents tracking where you were. The understanding was that you would come home when the streetlights came on, and that until then, the neighborhood was yours. The geography of a 1970s childhood was measured in the radius a child could cover on a bicycle in an afternoon, and that radius was surprisingly large. You knew every alley and every shortcut and every yard where the dog was tied, and every yard where it was not. You knew which vacant lot had the best climbing tree, and which storm drain ran deep enough to be interesting, and which neighbour left their sprinkler on in the afternoon in a way that you could run through without being asked to leave. This knowledge was earned through days of unrestricted movement, accumulated the way all genuine knowledge is accumulated, by being present in a place long enough to understand it from the inside. The group of children you spent those days with was fluid and self-organising, in a way that required no adult coordination. Someone appeared at the door in the morning and you went out to meet them, and by the time you reached the end of the block there were 3 of you, and by the time you reached the vacant lot there were 6, assembled from the yards and porches and front stoops of the surrounding streets by a network of information that travelled entirely by shouting and bicycle. The group made its own decisions about where to go and what to do, negotiated its own conflicts, established its own rules for whatever game had been invented that week, and enforced them with the particular seriousness that children bring to the governance of their own invented worlds. Parents in the 1970s were present in their children's lives without being constantly present in their children's days, and this distinction was not experienced as neglect, but as the normal shape of how childhood worked. Your mother knew approximately where you were in the way that someone knows approximately where the tide is, a general awareness without precise tracking, grounded in the assumption that the neighbourhood was a comprehensible environment and that children moving through it were capable of managing most of what they encountered. The assumption was not always correct, but it was held widely and sustained a particular quality of childhood freedom that has become increasingly rare. The skinned knees and the occasional broken bone and the afternoon that went wrong in ways that required an adult to be found and consulted were understood as the normal costs of the kind of childhood that produced competent, self-reliant people. You learned to fall because you fell. You learned to read situations because you encountered situations without a parent beside you to interpret them. You learned that some risks resolved themselves, and some required you to change course, and some required you to go find a grown-up, and the knowledge of which was which came from experience rather than instruction. The shift away from this kind of unsupervised outdoor childhood happened gradually across the 1980s and accelerated through the 90s, driven by a combination of factors that included changing perceptions of stranger danger, increasing traffic in residential neighborhoods, the rise of scheduled activities that filled the unstructured hours, and eventually the arrival of indoor screens that offered an alternative to the street that required no negotiation with weather or other children. The streetlights still came on at the same hour, but the children were already inside. What the 1970s gave those children who grew up in its long, unstructured summers was a relationship with their own neighbourhood that was intimate and earned and entirely their own. They knew it the way you only know a place that you've moved through freely, without agenda, without a destination more specific than outside, without anyone telling you when to come back in. The streets belonged to them in a way that is harder to claim now, and the memory of that belonging, specific and sensory and quietly irreplaceable, is one of the things that generation carries forward into a world that has organised childhood very differently, with intentions that are good and costs that are real, and a question underneath it all about what exactly was lost when the instruction go outside stopped being sufficient on its own. There is a moment in any era when the things that felt permanent begin to shift. For the 1970s, that moment came gradually, then all at once. The studies accumulated, the lawsuits were filed, the mothers organised and the legislators listened, and one by one the things that had felt like simple facts of daily life were reclassified as risks, then as dangers, then as things that could no longer be allowed. And the decade that had felt so free, so open, so certain of itself, quietly became the before in a very long lesson about what ordinary life had been costing all along. The changes did not arrive with trumpets. They arrived in the form of a notice on a product label that had not been there the previous year, or a news segment on the evening broadcast that mentioned a study, or a letter from the school explaining that a certain policy was being revised, or a conversation at the hardware store where the clerk mentioned that something you'd been buying for years was being discontinued. Each change was small on its own. The cumulative effect was a decade-long renegotiation of what ordinary life was allowed to contain. The people who lived through this renegotiation experienced it differently depending on where they stood in relation to the things being changed. For those whose children had been harmed by lead paint or lawn darts, or the absence of a car seat, the changes arrived with the particular bitterness of something that had been obvious in retrospect and inexcusably slow in coming. For those who had grown up inside the practices being prohibited, who had walked the railroad tracks and played with clackers and driven home from parties without a second thought, the changes arrived as something more complicated, a mixture of recognition and loss. The understanding that the world you had inhabited without harm was not one that had been safe for everyone who moved through it. The scientists who had been publishing research in journals that most people never read found, in this period, that their work had finally developed enough mass to reach the places where decisions were made. The researchers who had tracked blood lead levels and blood alcohol concentrations and the injury rates associated with specific products had been building a case for years before the case was heard, and the hearing, when it came, produced changes that the evidence had warranted long before the culture was ready to accept them. The gap between knowing and acting is one of the persistent features of how human societies manage risk, and the 1970s illustrates it with particular clarity. What made the decade distinctive was not that it was reckless, but that it was the last era in which a certain kind of unreflective confidence about ordinary life was still widely available. The confidence that the products on the shelves had been considered carefully enough. The confidence that the habits passed down through families were safe because they were familiar. The confidence that freedom and safety were not in tension in any way that required serious attention. That confidence did not survive the decade intact, and its loss was not entirely a loss, because some of what it had been covering over was genuinely harmful and genuinely needed to be changed. But something went with it that was harder to name and harder to replace. The ease of moving through daily life without cataloguing its risks. The freedom of a childhood that assumed the world was navigable and left you to navigate it. The particular quality of trust that exists when you have not yet been given specific reasons to withhold it. These things thinned and then faded as the decades accumulated, and the knowledge grew, and the regulations arrived to address what the knowledge had revealed. The 1970s sit at the edge of that transition, 1 foot in the era of unreflective confidence, and 1 foot in the era of documented risk, and the people who grew up there carry both of those worlds inside them. They remember what it felt like to move through a neighbourhood without anyone tracking their location, to drink from a garden hose in the summer heat, to ride in the back of a pickup truck on a country road with the wind doing whatever it wanted to their hair. And they also know now what some of that freedom cost, in bodies and in blood, and in the slow accumulation of exposures that took years to become visible as harm. The streetlights came on, the children came home, and somewhere in a government office and a university laboratory and a mother's living room, the work of changing what tomorrow would look like was already underway, patient and persistent and arriving, as change always arrives, before most people were quite ready to receive it. In the 1970s, when a child ran a fever that climbed too high on a Wednesday night, the first call was not to an urgent care line or an automated triage system. It was to Dr. Whoever, whose home number was written in the back of the address book in your mother's handwriting, and who might, if the situation warranted it, arrive at your door within the hour carrying a black bag that smelled of leather and antiseptic, and the particular authority of someone who'd been trusted with your family's health for a decade. The house call was not yet extinct in the 1970s. It was fading, but it was still there, and the families who had access to it understood it as one of the quiet dignities of ordinary life. The doctor who came to the house knew the family in the way that only long acquaintance produces. He knew which child was prone to ear infections, and which one ran high fevers at the first sign of any illness, and which parent asked too many questions, and which one asked too few. He had delivered some of the children in those houses, or had been present shortly after, and the relationship that began in those early years continued through childhood illnesses and adolescent injuries, and the slower, more complicated health concerns of middle age. He was not a specialist. He was the person you called first, and his generalism was a feature rather than a limitation, because what most families needed most of the time was someone who knew them well enough to recognise when something was different. The office, when you went to it rather than having the doctor come to you, was a place of particular character. A waiting room with chairs along the walls and a low table with magazines that were always slightly out of date. A receptionist who had worked there long enough to know which patients needed to be seen quickly, and which ones could be asked to wait without feeling dismissed. The examination room smelled of rubbing alcohol and the slightly sweet chemical scent of the tongue depressors in their glass jar on the counter, and the paper on the examination table crinkled when you sat on it, in a way that was specific and unrepeatable, and entirely associated in memory with the feeling of being looked after. The medicine practiced in those rooms was the medicine of its moment, confident and personal, and working from the best available evidence, which was in some areas excellent and in other areas considerably less so. Antibiotics were prescribed with a generosity that later understanding of antibiotic resistance would complicate significantly. Dietary advice reflected nutritional science that subsequent decades would substantially revise. The recommendations came with authority and were received with trust, because the doctor was known, and the relationship was real, and the trust had been built over years of small interactions that accumulated into something that felt like genuine care. The transition away from the house call and toward the large practice and the urgent care clinic and the specialist referral happened for reasons that were partly economic and partly structural, and partly the result of a medical system that was reorganizing itself around efficiency in ways that squeezed out the time-intensive practice of knowing patients as individuals rather than as cases. The doctor who carried a black bag to your door on a Wednesday night required hours that the modern system does not make available, and the intimacy that made that visit meaningful required a continuity of relationship that the modern system does not reliably sustain. What was lost in that reorganization is difficult to quantify and easy to feel. The sense of being known by the person responsible for your health. The particular reassurance of a familiar face arriving at your door when the fever was high and the night was long. The medicine cabinet stocked with things he had recommended specifically for your family, for your children, for the particular pattern of illness that your household tended toward. These were not inefficiencies. They were the human content of medical care, and their absence is one of the things that people who remember the 1970s mention when they try to describe what has changed in ways that the statistics do not quite capture. The black bag is in a museum somewhere, or in an attic, or in the memory of a child who watched it come through the front door on a winter evening and felt, immediately and completely, that things were going to be all right. In the 1970s, the thumb extended at the roadside was a form of communication that both sides of the transaction understood completely. You stood at the edge of the highway with your bag at your feet and your arm out, and you waited for a car to slow and pull over onto the shoulder, and when it did, you walked up to the window and a brief negotiation took place. Where are you going? How far? And then you got in, and the car pulled back onto the road, and you were moving again toward wherever you needed to be. This was hitchhiking, and in the 1970s it was not considered particularly brave or particularly foolish. It was simply how some people got around when they did not have a car or a bus ticket or enough money for either. The culture around hitchhiking in that decade was built on a foundation of assumptions about shared community and mutual good faith that the era sustained more easily than later decades would. The person who picked you up was a neighbour in the broader sense, someone moving through the same geography, heading in the same direction, with a car that had empty seats and no particular reason not to fill one of them for a stretch of road. The transaction cost was minimal, and the social contract was simple. You did not cause trouble, they did not cause trouble, and at the end of the ride you said thank you and got out and continued on your way. College students hitchhiked between campuses and home without much parental concern, beyond the general wish that you would call when you arrived. Young people travelling across the country in the summer discovered America from the passenger seats of strangers' cars, accumulating conversations and landscapes, and the particular knowledge that comes from being deposited unexpectedly in places you had not planned to see. The interstate highway system, completed enough by the 1970s to make long-distance travel by road genuinely practical, became the infrastructure for a kind of informal mass transit that operated entirely on goodwill and the willingness of drivers to stop. Truck drivers were a particular institution within this world. Long-haul truckers on the overnight runs between cities sometimes picked up hitchhikers for the company as much as anything else, for someone to talk to through the dark hours on an empty interstate, and the conversations that happened in those cab-overs between a driver who had been on the road for 12 hours and a traveller who had been on the shoulder for 2 were the kind that the ordinary social arrangements of daily life did not produce. Candid and temporary and strangely intimate, the conversation of people who would never see each other again and therefore had no reason to be anything other than honest. The safety statistics told a complicated story, as safety statistics tend to do when the behaviour under examination is one that most people engage in without incident, and a small percentage of people do not. Crimes involving hitchhikers occurred, and they were reported, and the reporting accumulated over the decade in ways that shifted the cultural perception of the practice from ordinary to risky. By the 1980s, the shift was visible in the way parents talked to their children about it, and by the 90s, the thumb at the roadside had become something associated with desperation rather than practicality, and the cars that once slowed to pull over now passed without slowing. The road is the same road, the cars are the same cars. What changed was the shared assumption of good faith that made the whole arrangement possible. And once that assumption was gone, the practice that depended on it went with it. leaving behind only the occasional figure at the roadside and the drivers passing by without stopping, each one carrying the memory of a different version of what that moment used to mean. On the last day of June in the 1970s, the roadside stands appeared as reliably as the heat itself. Plywood tables and striped canvas awnings set up at the edges of parking lots and along the shoulders of state routes, staffed by teenagers who could tell you the difference between a Roman candle and a bottle rocket with the confidence of genuine expertise. You pulled over and walked along the table looking at the merchandise, the labels bright and slightly lurid, the names promising effects that were either spectacular or explosive or both, and you chose what you could afford and drove home with a paper bag on the seat beside you that rustled whenever you turned a corner. The 4th of July in a 1970s neighbourhood was an extended acoustic event. It began in the afternoon, when the impatient ones started with the smaller items, the snakes that produced a growing column of ash on the driveway, the sparklers that the youngest children could hold at arm's length and write their names in the darkening air, the smoke bombs that turned the backyard briefly and beautifully red or green or purple. By the time the actual dark arrived, the neighbourhood was fully committed, and the sound that came from every direction at once was not a single fireworks display, but dozens of simultaneous private celebrations, each yard contributing its own small portion of light and noise to the collective event that the entire street was sharing without having organised it. The skill involved in a good backyard fireworks show was real, and taken seriously by the people who considered themselves its practitioners. You learned which things needed to be anchored and which could be held, and which required a longer fuse than the label suggested, and which required you to step back considerably farther than seemed necessary. You learned from older relatives who had done this for years, who had developed through accumulated experience a working knowledge of what each product would do and what could go wrong, and how to manage the gap between the two. This knowledge was passed down in the practical, informal way of skills that live in families rather than in instruction manuals. Burns happened. Fingers were singed and hands were startled, and on occasion someone was hurt more seriously than a singed finger, and the emergency rooms on the nights around the 4th of July saw the results of backyard pyrotechnics with a regularity that public health researchers documented and legislators eventually used to justify the restrictions that came. The pattern of injury was real, and the argument for reducing access to the most dangerous consumer fireworks was grounded in genuine evidence about what those products did to the people using them without professional training or equipment. State laws on consumer fireworks varied enormously through the 1970s and continued to vary. A patchwork of permissions and prohibitions that made the legality of a particular firework depend entirely on which side of a state line you were standing on when you lit it. Some states permitted nearly everything sold at the roadside stands. Others restricted consumer fireworks to sparklers and snakes and the most modest items. The stands appeared wherever the law allowed them, and sometimes slightly beyond that boundary, and the families who drove to the stand in the neighbouring state and brought the bag home across the line were engaging in a kind of small-scale interstate commerce that nobody was particularly interested in prosecuting. The backyard show of the 1970s was imperfect and occasionally dangerous and entirely communal, in a way that the organised municipal display watched from a blanket in a public park cannot quite replicate. The light came from your neighbour's yard and the yard across the street, and the smoke drifted through the whole neighbourhood carrying the smell of sulphur and summer. And for an hour on a July night, the street belonged to everyone who lived on it in a way that felt and was genuinely shared. And so we come to the end of our walk through the 1970s, a decade of open car windows and backyard games and corner stores and the particular freedom of a summer day with nowhere specific to be. A decade that trusted too easily in some things and not carefully enough in others, but that also held inside its ordinary hours a warmth and a slowness, and a kind of human texture that is worth remembering. Think for a moment about the people who lived those days. The mother folding laundry while the radio played in the next room. The father backing the station wagon out of the driveway on a Saturday morning. Kids already sprawled across the back seat. No particular plan beyond the day itself. The neighbour who waved from the porch. The doctor who knew your name. The farmer who filled the glass bottle and set it in the cooler and trusted that someone would come for it. These were not extraordinary people living extraordinary lives. They were ordinary people doing the quiet, essential work of keeping a life going, and there is a dignity in that work that no amount of historical distance can diminish. The world they lived in needed changing in some of the ways we have talked about tonight, and it was beautiful in ways that the changing could not entirely preserve. Both of those things are true, and you are allowed to hold them together without having to resolve them. Carry something small from this evening forward with you. A little slowness, maybe. A moment noticed before it passes. The willingness to wave from the porch, or to linger at the table a little longer than the schedule requires. And now let the day go. Let the lights dim and the quiet settle around you like something familiar and kind. You have been here. You have remembered. That is enough. Good night.